I'm Michael Kelleher, Director of the Windham-Campbell Prizes at Yale University. Welcome to the 2021 Windham-Campbell Prizes Virtual Festival. We'll be streaming a new episode each week for the next 9 Wednesdays. Each episode will focus on one of this year's prize recipients, and the final episode will be a keynote address by U.S. Poet Laureate Joy Harjo. While the episodes stream, you'll be able to chat with other audience members, and following the live stream, we invite you to join the writer in a live Zoom Q&A. In the week between each episode, there will be plenty of on-demand content available for you to enjoy. Today's episode features poet Natalie Scenters-Zapico. She's the author of 2 collections of poetry, The Verging Cities and Lima Limón. She'll be talking with her husband, José Ángel Maldonado, about borders, immigration, and surveillance, while making hand-painted postcard poems she'll later mail to friends as a way to combat her feelings of isolation during the pandemic.
Hi, this is my husband, José Ángel Maldonado. He's joining me this morning while I work on my poetry postcard project, which I started in January 2021 in the middle of quarantine as a way to reach out to the world, especially to people who I didn't have a relationship with. That was actually the thing that I feel like I miss most during quarantine, is the fact that all of these small interactions that we would have on a daily basis with people who we maybe didn't know personally were pretty much gone. And so unless you knew someone and you wanted to Zoom with them or whatever, you were put in a situation where, you were very isolated. We all were isolated. So I decided to start making postcards that I would make over the stretch of a morning. And they have an illustration on one side and some lines of poetry on the other. And it just sort of grew little by little. And I was interested in people's reactions to them, but also in how making them changed my way of even seeing how I would interact with the world. Because suddenly, I was like, oh, that would be cool for a postcard, right? Very different than before. So it's been fun.
Yeah, there are a lot of interesting things about the Postcard Project. It sounds to me like part of what you're doing is looking for a way to develop community in an era and during a time in which it seems like almost impossible to connect with people who you don't know, given that the technology that we have, we rely so much on this sort of faith that when you're reaching out through a computer, the person on the other side of the computer is a real person or the person that you're talking to. And so this Postcard Project is interesting to me because it doesn't necessarily do away with that, but it does at least give you a print of, someone, right? Like someone drew this and there's some uniqueness to this card that I'm getting and somebody touched this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that I really liked also about making a postcard is that I had to spend a good amount of time with that piece of paper, but also that I sort of have to dedicate it to someone in that moment of writing down their name and their address, whether I know them or not. And it becomes for them, but also for the various hands that it travels through. And so I really liked this, and I was interested in it. And also, it's been really fun to see how people have engaged with it, both in posting the postcards that they get, online, but also sharing with me when they get the postcards and waiting for them to get the postcards. And that act of waiting has been of interest because it creates a kind of silence that I think is often missing in a lot of the technological ways that we now communicate with each other that I miss. There's a lot of communication that happens in silences that just no longer happen. And that's sad. And sometimes the postcard is a great way of trying to replicate that.
It seems to me that there's also like a meshing of traditions that you're working with. Not just the tradition of the post, but also the tradition of limiting yourself to a particular space on a postcard, right? So there are only so many words you can fit into a postcard. And if you put the address of a person who's getting the postcard, then that already takes a fraction of your postcard, right? And if you happen to write also your address on you, you're now dealing with even less space on that postcard.
Yeah, formally as a poet, it's exciting because it really does create that formal constraint immediately, right? By having the small space of what the postcard can be and what you're allowed to write and work with in that tight space.
Can you tell us a little bit about the things that you put on the postcard, about the images, where they come from, what inspires them?
So I'm really interested in what I can do in one sitting to make 15 postcards in one sitting. And part of that is then the exploration of what it is that I'm interested in that particular moment. And so recently, a lot of that has been based in what I've been doing a lot of reading on, which is borderland security technologies, which of course we grew up and were living in the border, along the border in El Paso, Juarez, during the beginning of a lot of that militarization of the border. And a lot of the borderland security technologies that we see in place today all over the country, we of course knew them on our daily life because of living on the US-Mexico border. So that's everything from like facial recognition scanning, right? Biometrics, all of the surveillance technology, the implementation of CCTV everywhere, right? Including on streets. When we were in El Paso, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but this is in the Obama era. The largest concentration of FBI agents in the country was in El Paso, Texas, right? And so you have the police, the Border Patrol, and then you also have all of the FBI. So you're constantly surveilled. And this was before we now are talking about surveillance all the time. So I'm really interested in how we incorporate and think about those and normalize those security technologies on a daily basis, right? And looking at artists that are also and have been interested in that too.
One of the technologies that I kept thinking about as you were talking was the drone, right? It's such a fascinating thing because a lot of people, when they think about drones, they think about some sort of toy, sort of like an aerial version of an RC car, right? Something that you can take around and sort of have fun with and capture images from angles that you probably wouldn't otherwise have. I know in communication, a lot of journalists are excited about drones because they get to take them into areas like crowds where they maybe don't have access to in other ways. We're talking here about technologies of vision, right? Technologies that extend our capacity to see. And I'm wondering if there's something about that sort of technophilia, that love for technology, maybe that determinism, right? That like if we just accept that these new technologies are good.
That they can be fun.
They can be fun, right? If there's something that blinds us onto the darker side of technology.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the fact that people have drones that they play around with, that we see even drones in a more mundane pedestrian way, right? I think about the use of drones along beaches by, even just to like track sharks or whatever, but that's normalized, that's like okay, because they're also watching us, right, when we're at the beach. And what that means and what that then can do and look like. And the narratives that can then be obfuscated by the state, right, in that act of surveillance. There's this idea that if we found it in surveillance, then it must be true, and it must be so, and it must be what we saw, without the understanding that there's also a narrative that is created even in CCTV footage.
So like the magical side of the camera, right? There's this idea that it captures things objectively that I think Bart talked about this idea as like the camera does two things, right? It tells you that something factually happened at some point, right? But the interpretive side of that image, right? Like what the human side of that image is what is usually obscured, right? What we usually attempt to do away with in order to give power to an image, right?
Totally.
That's fascinating.
I think a lot in this conversation also about the ways in which we're always telling narratives to the state and trying to create a way in which our narratives are not viewed as criminal by the state. And that there's also agents whose job is to either find holes in that narrative that criminalize people, or their job is to say, yes, this is a good person, someone who fits the norm of the society, and so we'll welcome them into our society. So of course, what I'm talking about here is when you apply, right, for citizenship in this country, through marriage, let's say, and like, what does that do?
Surveillance almost invites you to perform, right? Surveillance, whether we're talking about somebody literally watching you, invites you to perform something. And so if the person watching or the thing watching is somebody who requires something from you, right, then you're going to perform some normative role, right?
I think of like the work of Harry Gamboa here, where he, I think, was really asking a lot of these questions at a time when a lot of people weren't. And of course, he was talking about the constant use of CCTV footage in Los Angeles, right? Specifically in, Latino neighborhoods. And his joke as a performance artist was that he then felt he was always performing, right? So as a performance artist, he would say, I'm going into the gas station and I am now performing.
The
right?
presence of the camera.
The presence of the camera makes me an actor at all times. And, this is like in the 70s when he starts to talk about this, but I'm interested in how, of course, now, fast forward, we are all asked to be actors constantly and to perform constantly, and that is somehow a reality. And the state perpetuates that narrative in that whatever they record of you and whatever you submit with regards to documents, you need them to approve them in a way that fits conventionality. And in the situation of applying for papers with regards to citizenship, it also, the last thing they want is a complicated narrative.
So it seems to me that when you apply for citizenship through marrying somebody, what is required of you is to demonstrate that you are in an authentic relationship with somebody, to demonstrate that you are in love with someone, right? And one of the most cliche things that I think we hear about poets is that poets write love poems, right? That we have this like idea of a poet as somebody like a romantic poet, right? Somebody who's out there writing about clouds or something, something like this, right? And so,
or that it's used to woo someone.
Yeah.
Right? Yes.
And so what happens then if you were to present the state with a love story that isn't that, right? When you say, well, love is actually like a really messed up, vile, problematic thing, right? When you speak about love, you're using the language of private property, right? You're saying, I love this and I want to make this mine, right? You are mine, will you be mine? And the forms, right, that you have to submit to the state when you apply for citizenship also require that your love be put in the context of something like clan or like family or like
because
tribe.
They ask for all of the documentation, not just of your relationship, but also of your parents, right? So they immediately then also, in some ways, you could argue they vouch for the love of your parents, right? And are they good examples of a citizen, so that we know that this person will in fact pay their taxes, will in fact, right, vote, does hold down a job, right? All of these things you're sort of held to the standard of, which is also a violence, that you have to let people in that much, right?
No, entirely. That in order for you to go through this process, you have to open up the private, and it appears to be the private toward another type of privacy, but it slowly, the normalization of that process means that the private has to become public, right? And that people think that they're entitled to your private life, right?
Yeah. And I mean, even in the case of an interview or a recorded conversation like this one, no, really, I mean, part of the anxiety, even for me in this, is the fact that even by the left, oftentimes we view the interview, the recorded conversation, all of these things as being truth, right? Or as being the example of that person, without realizing that I think if any good critic or any good artist should always be questioning even the things that they're saying, what it is, changing over time, their perspective on things. And so, sure, the things that we say are true today, but I don't know what will be held in the future, right? And how those truths will hold up based on the zeitgeist of that moment. And so that then becomes also an anxiety, I think, for a lot of artists that are making work right now.
This idea takes me back to the idea of the postcard, to be honest, because it's almost like the postcard is something that when you draw something on there, right, this thing has your prints on it, right, your traces, and maybe it speaks to a moment, maybe it speaks to a type of truth, but the dynamism is what's lost, right? People then might take one aspect of you, one slice of your life, and treat it as the stand-in, right? As the thing that represents the author, the painter, etc., without necessarily looking into the things that came before and the things that are to follow.
Well, and in this culture, it also then becomes a question of, it's not just what you say, but how you say it. So is it entertaining? It's not just the idea of what you say, but it's also, is it palatable towards people in that particular moment in time? And I think that we don't think about that or are forgiving enough with that stuff, right? With how people can, even though it's recorded, that might, it might not even represent a particular moment, but it's not necessarily, just because the piece is stagnant in time doesn't mean that the person is stagnant in time.
Thinking back to the topic of love, I think one of the earliest pieces of poetry that you and I shared when we got to know each other all those years ago was Lee Young Lee's "The City in Which I Love You." And I remember that sometimes it's been so long since I thought about this book, but it felt like such a powerful book because of where we were in our lives, right? We were in a city that defined us, and we felt close to each other but apart from each other. We felt like we were inhabiting entirely different universes, and there's something about the idea of love that I think is often that people fear to talk about, right? There's something that they want to sort of run away from. And yeah, I wonder if you could speak a little bit to the role of place and fear in your writing about things like concepts like love or a similar concept.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that was a really interesting time. We were living in an apartment on Crosby that was
Crosby Street in
El Paso, Texas. That was like $425. Do you remember that? A month?
$425 a month, and it felt like $4,000.
Yeah, it felt like $4,000 to us at that time. And it had really crooked floors. So like it was on the second story and everything was like lopsided.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I loved about that apartment was that it had this amazing view of Juarez. You could see all the lights of Juarez from the window because it was near downtown. And
And when we say the window, we're talking about a small window in the back of a kitchen.
Yeah.
That
to be clear.
was nowhere near like a living room or even a bedroom, right? But it was still the most beautiful view.
Yeah, it was
Juárez.
Beautiful. It was also, I don't know if you remember, sliced into like a bunch of triangles, that view, because of all of the electrical wires.
Yes.
Right?
Correct.
So it's not like a perfect, pristine view.
But you could see the valley. You could see the valley, and you could see this enormous Mexico flag house on the other side of that's in Juárez. And
yeah, and I think about, it's interesting that you bring up The City in Which I Love You, because at that time I was really, that book by Lee Young Lee was so important to me. And I look back especially to my work, to writing my first book, The Verging Cities, because that book opened up the possibility for me to think about love of place as not being different or less than love for, your beloved, right? That those two things could be interchangeable. That the longing of the immigrant for a homeland can be comparable to the longing for a beloved that is not physically there in that moment. That you can kind of complicate these things and turn them back and forth. And it gave me a lot of permission to do that. And so even though Liang Li is not, of course, writing about El Paso Juárez, it, for me, like opened up a whole new way to see also these border cities as both having a really historically loving relationship with each other, but also a really dysfunctional, violent love for each other. And codependency, right, that was also extremely toxic, where one partner, if you will, acts like they don't need the other one, when in fact they absolutely do economically. And so I was interested in that, like how can you flip that on your head? And it opened a lot of metaphorical possibilities, for sure.
Border cities are these spaces that sort of force you to think about possibilities and impossibilities, right? They force you to think about the sort of apocalyptic. They force you to think about death and ends. Rather than think about, this is where I want my life to be, people think about something like, what will happen when I die, or how will I die, or those are the sort of things that I think I was thinking about a lot at the time. And I remember that book allowed me to think about something like deportation as entering a different realm of existence, right? Or thinking about moving to a different place and having the limits of an exile, right? Having the limitations of you cannot move, you cannot sort of move freely.
When we're thinking about deportation and the way the narratives that are told around it, oftentimes it is viewed as a death, right? That you are being literally deported to your death. And sometimes that is absolutely the case. What I don't think is always talked about is what that means, right? So sometimes it is absolutely a literal death into violence that you are being deported into. But even if that's not the case, even if, let's say, best case scenario, right? You are deported and you have a place to land. You're still experiencing an entire death of an identity, of who you are, everything you've known, and expected to not only start over, of course, economically, but even for yourself as a person. Who are you in this new place? And how do you understand yourself in this new place? And that is another plane of existence.
Yeah, and how do you communicate with who you used to be? How do you communicate with people who were in your life? Or what is their new role in your life, right?
So the fear then really lies in that, right? And shouldn't be minimized, I think, to my mind. So one of the things with these postcards, the other part that I did not mention is that I wanted to engage in art that I was a novice at, that I was not very good at, that I was never told I was good at in any way, shape, or form. Actually, on the contrary, with drawing in art classes, I was always sort of like, they were like, okay, you're okay at that, I guess. You can keep going. But I always really enjoyed it. And I think that sometimes, when you are engaging, when you're and when you work in making art, it's really, you get in these cycles where you know how to do certain things and you know how you have certain patterns that you know work, and you can get stuck in those patterns. And after my second book, I definitely felt that way for a long time. I felt like I was writing the same poems over and over and over again. And it was really hard, and it was really bothersome to me. I felt like Heather Crissell writes that one of the things that you have to do when you finish a book is you have to create a trap door into the next book, or else you'll get stuck in that book. And I think I forgot to create a trap door for myself after Lima Limon. And so my way out was to try to do things that were really outside of my comfort zone, like drawing, that I'm not particularly good at. I just like it, and see if I could find a really informal audience for it, which for me was these postcards. And I think there's a lot of growth in doing that. I also started making lithograph prints and doing kind of little cuts. I did some work at Bennington College when I was there with some people who were really, really good at that. And it was fascinating, kind of the way that it opens up your mind, because the stakes are low. You're not going to be great at it because you have not dedicated time to it, and because you are barely figuring out even what on earth you're doing. So let alone getting any concrete ideas out there. If you do, then it's great, but you're also not held to the same standard as I think you are later.
When you told me that you were doing this project with the postcards, I thought of people who have been exiled and people who have been sort of imprisoned in the past, and who were using the sort of confines, right, the limitations of a card to get messages out of places like prisons. I thought about Ernesto Gramsci. I thought about Ricardo Flores Magón. Vasco Popa. I thought of Vasco Popa, right? The importance of being able to create images that can sort of expand into larger universes, right? So in my own writing, I think sometimes what I try to do is also translate. If I can find, for example, a news story that is written in Portuguese or in Spanish, it allows me to think about concepts in different ways. Even something as small as the translation of a particular word can open up an entire new universe to the way that you're seeing a particular situation.
Yeah, I think translation is so interesting because it really forces you to think about the worlds that we create within the confines of our languages and the limitations of that, but then also how that limitation, just like a form in poetry, opens up whole new worlds and ways of thinking based on having the confines of that original text, and how you can kind of move within that text to create your own translation of that text. And then how that can help you see your own language and your own writing in a completely different way, right? And I'm always interested too in poets whose work, even if it's written in English, plays with the language in a way that feels like it's in translation, or feels like they're playing with the language in a way that's influenced by the grammatical structures of another language, and what that can do, right? How that's still communicating. In many ways, it's like the way that our mothers communicate, right, with the world in perhaps grammatically incorrect structures, but are still understood, and beyond that, open up new worlds and ways of seeing that were not available before that moment, right? Which I think is amazing that you can do that in a moment.
It seems to me like your second book was more about the domestic, right? Your first book was about the city. Your second book was about spaces that are sort of domestic and maybe even private. And I think right now, here we are sitting in front of our kitchen. working in our home. And a lot of the reason behind that is COVID, as you know, and the quarantine. But I wonder if there's something then about the domestic space that is asking you to sort of step out, is asking you to sort of reach out to people who you don't know because of what your last book was about.
So the domestic sphere, I have a very strange relationship with, as you know. So the first is that I suffer from a lot of anxiety, like very bad panic attacks. I'm a very anxious person, and I can really only be outside of my home for, especially with people, a given number of hours before I just completely crash. And so I both am grateful to have the space of a home to be able to have that time to sort of recenter and come back to self. At the same time, it can be very isolating having to engage with the world in that way. And quarantine, I noticed that I had just as before quarantine, I was relying on the domestic space to come down. I felt like I had no outlet to sort of feel, to ever get a moment of up, right? And so that then became really challenging for me. In my second book, I was teaching high school full time, and my mother was a Spanish teacher. She taught mostly elementary school, though in her last few years she taught also high school. And I felt in that moment like I was really in the confines of my domestic space all the time, and like I thought I was leading this very radical life, and I perhaps was not. And so, because how different was my life than my mother's or my grandmother's? It really wasn't that different. And so I wrote a book where I forced myself to really confront a lot of that baggage and the way that I even romanticized having a domestic space, especially as a young woman. And then once I had it, I felt trapped by it, right? I felt suffocated by it in a lot of ways. And I didn't know, I had to figure out how to navigate my own way around it that was mine, that wasn't inherited from someone else, that wasn't learned from someone else in a really toxic relationship to it. And it's ongoing, right? It's not something that I can't tell you the magical way through that. I think it's personal for every person, especially women. But I also think it's a really important journey, especially if you have a really loaded sense of the domestic sphere due to, cultural norms, like machismo, marianismo, kind of the romanticization of a lot of those roles and what those things look like and what a good life looks like.
As you think about your work today, what is the sort of role of beauty and joy on the border, but also on the work that you hope to create as you sort of move into this new stage in your life?
It's hard.
It's hard.
It's hard. I think that one of the things that I am interested in is finding moments where I can feel, I think, safe, even within the confines of my own poems. I often write work where I look at very scary things, very intense images, a lot of trauma from my own life, and I don't always feel safe within my own poems. And it becomes really difficult. I dread, for example, having to talk a lot about my work with people because it forces me to be very vulnerable about things that are extremely challenging. And I don't just mean like mental health wise, though that's definitely there, but literally a lot of the trauma that we both have survived at the hands of the state, and a lot of the trauma that we both have had to deal with regards to understanding a lot of those years when we were really young and trying to navigate a system that was very much against us. And if I can hope to one day write something where I can feel safe in the confines of a poem, that would be, I think, a real moment of beauty and joy for me. And it's a goal of mine. And perhaps a way in is through doing things where I have to sort of be silly. I have to sort of risk failing, right? And that being okay. And that the stakes are not, a plane of existence, a plane of death, right? And so that's really what I can hope for. Okay, I think we're pretty much done. The mule deer had always watched us, but tonight the bucks were different. Young bucks lit up with green lights to watch us in the nighttime, always tracking movement for black hawks circling above. When the birds began perching on the border wall, the agents installed electrical wires to zap their feathers, then metal traps to break their small talons. A high-pitched frequency was emitted from speakers to stun their small bodies. Still, the birds perched.
We're going to end today's episode with a short reading. But before we do, I'd like to invite you to a live Zoom conversation immediately following the episode.
1,723 miles away from home. For years, doctors wrote in private files of my paranoia, my panic disorders. I took slow-release pills that made me start a story, then laugh. I just told you this one, didn't I? Strangers would roll their eyes, but I was well-liked and enjoyed holding company with the living. I would wake up and count the hours until I could return to bed. I suffered an illness caused by the sun on my neck. A shrill opera of summer insects made me want to be a mother like the mother I had, a mother who wouldn't get out of bed. At dinner parties, people would look for signs of my poverty when I tell them I got married at 23 on a hot day in June. How to explain that the state has my whole life documented in interrogations, home visits, photographs, medical examinations, tax records, family history, a bankroll of debt. 5 years of humiliation for a green card to arrive in an unmarked envelope. A green card, not mine, a green card for every person I've ever loved who did not have one. Couldn't I swap out the numbers, the photo, the name, each chipped facial scan? I could not, but I imagined. I swore to never give that much of myself to strangers ever again, but I did. I gave myself away time after time. The girl dancing cumbia in the kitchen never returned. No community would have me, so I communed with the spoonful of bad medicine under my tongue. After a reading to a full auditorium, a woman nagged me through a microphone. Tell the youth in this room what you do for self-care. I told her I spend long periods in silence, which helped me survive another year. Like most people, I fear dying. Like most people, I fear dying far from home.